Recently, I was in Zambia, and that was at the 22nd annual meetings of the African Export-Import Bank. I caught up, as I said earlier, with Frannie Leautier. Now, she used to be with the Africa Capacity Building Foundation, but she left that organization and went back home to Tanzania, and I asked her what she's been up to.
First of all, I wrote a book. I used the time, yes, in between leaving ACBF and what I'm doing now to work on a book. And it's called Leadership in a Globalized World, Complexity, Dynamics and Risk. And it comes from some of the work I had started to do before going to ACBF and continued while I was there, which was a course teaching master's students and experienced policymakers on leadership issues in a globalized world.
Yeah, I got interested in that book because I thought, what would you have been writing about? Because we thought you were so immersed with your work at the Africa Capacity Building Foundation. So you are picking up lessons from the work that you were doing at the Africa Capacity Building Foundation, while at the same time picking up on your teaching lessons.
In fact, that was a very good experience for me, since before coming to the African Capacity Building Foundation, I was working at the World Bank, and so got to see the world from a different perspective and was really involved in global processes, working in Latin America and Asia, and of course seeing the evolution in Eastern Europe and so on. So when I came to ACBF, I was focusing only on Africa, and being a Tanzanian, that gave me an opportunity to look at Africa, but with this global experience in the back view mirror. And I think that is what helped me to change even the nature of what I was teaching, because the course was in very high demand by African universities. So it was a natural step, ACBF being a place for capacity building, that working with universities to have a 6-week-a-year course where you spend a day in those 1 day a week in those 6 weeks. So it was not a whole commitment of time, a total of 6 days a year to teach that course, and using the opportunity from the questions and the experiences of traveling around to update the course. So after that, before I jumped into what I'm doing now in private equity, I thought, let me not lose all that valuable learning. And so I locked myself up and for about 5 months focused on getting the book off the ground.
Let's talk about some of the ideas that you explore in that book. Obviously you talk about leadership, but I guess for many people, one of the big challenges of our time is of course managing change. How do you deal with that?
Well, the book actually is about change because the first question, it's structured around 6 key questions that leadership, whether in the public sector, private sector or civil society, grapples with, and therefore what one needs to know in order to be successful in navigating in that changing world. So the first question is, what is changing? And then of course, what patterns does that produce? What is driving those changes? So you understand some of the causal mechanisms for that. What are the governance implications for leadership? Because usually these changes shake the very ground in which decisions are made. And then finally, what can be valuable for you to navigate through your own decision-making process, knowing what is changing, why it's changing, and what implications it has.
In today's world, I suppose it's easier to say companies adapt quicker than countries. I mean, you are directing this message at countries and companies. When you look at it through the lens of your experience and through the lessons that you are drawing through the book, is that the case?
It's absolutely the case. In fact, the book is out now, but some of the things that I have talked about in the book keep repeating themselves in days after. For example, I look at the changes in the people sphere. And you look first of all at population growth and the implication it has for youth and aging. We have now a huge challenge with youth unemployment, which is coming from those very population dynamics. But similarly, in Africa in particular, and this has been the case in Europe and Japan for a long time, we have the challenge of taking care of the aging. In the case of Africa, it's because people now live in cities. The traditional mechanisms are no longer there to support the aging population, so we have to think about safety nets, the role of pension plans, and so on. So while the issues are the same, the application of them changes over time, and the impact varies across the different spheres. So I look first at the people sphere, and all the dynamics there, migration, urbanization, the impact of diseases. We're just handling the Ebola crisis in the book. I cover the SARS epidemic because that's what I lived through when I was working in Asia.
Yeah.
And then we look at the resource sphere, water constraints and the land to grow the food that we have.
What do you say to the idea that countries perhaps ought to be run along the same lines as companies, without exception?
I think in the book I cover this issue of leadership and governance, I think, which is very central. I think there is a good argument to be made about the values that come from looking at the discipline that companies use in terms of governance. Transparency of information, being aware of your customer, and in this case for a country, the citizens, and making sure that their priority needs are met. Also being able to work with a wide variety of stakeholders in order to get results to happen. And in the case of the issues we are grappling now on environmental pressures, changes in the labor market and the implications, climate change, companies are working on those issues today because they have to. Now there is a difference, however, when you are leading a country, because the responsibilities go even beyond what companies would have to be looking at, because the motive of leading a country is not profit. It is sustainability in the long run, ability to deliver results for the broadest inclusive value of your population. And I think these differences also show up in the differences around governance. But I would say there's a lot to be learned by looking at successful companies in thinking how we could build successful countries. But vice versa, companies now have to learn a lot from how political leaders manage, and therefore the two worlds in an interesting way are getting more and more interdependent, the world of politics and the world of business.
And absolutely, and also of course we have to make sure that the right type of person gets into politics, because if they've got the right mindset they will be able to change and lead in this globalized world. But you've also been busy, apart from writing the book, you have also set up the Mkoba Fund, where you are the chairperson. Let's speak about how much you've raised so far, what are you targeting, when are you going to see the first projects being approved for funding?
All right. Well, Coba Fund was an idea that came about in between making choices, what do I do next after the African Capacity Building Foundation and the World Bank. And a Tanzanian colleague and myself sat down and we were discussing what are really the constraints to growth in the countries that we come from. In this case, we're looking at our own country, Tanzania. And one of the biggest bottlenecks that really was falling through the cracks was the small and medium enterprise that needs growth capital. A lot of opportunities for micro enterprises and even the informal sector. The big companies, they have no trouble accessing finance. Even foreign direct investment comes in targeting those kind of companies. But the small companies that are really have been there for a long time, that are the workhorse of the economy, because they represent between 60 and 80% of job creation across the countries. Those were the ones that were missing out in the opportunity space.
It's not startup, it's growth.
It is growth, so we target companies that need between $1 million and $15 million US for expansion. We look at companies that are in sectors that are very important for the economy, but they are also very dynamic. For example, agro-processing and agribusiness, which is one of the key areas. If we don't develop agro-processing and agribusiness, we cannot develop agriculture, and all our countries are very dependent on agriculture. The second is urban services. We are urbanizing very fast. We need all sorts of things, from waste collection to transport to a simple upgrading of the house, because now you are in the middle income category. And all the companies that serve the urban areas are growing also very fast, but they are starved for capital. And then finally, we see a lot of opportunity in technological leapfrogging, where you can unlock productivity improvements by changing technology on the production side, because these small companies, being starved of capital, have not been able to modernize and mechanize. And we can do it now also with a much cleaner environmental footprint, and therefore leapfrog ahead in the way you do business.
So this is still very much focused on Tanzania.
Well, it's focused on 6 countries. So we have Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania, Mozambique,
Great.
Rwanda and DRC. We have a T geographical strategy which helps get the benefits of regional integration, but at the same time keeps our geographies connected so that we are not spread out too thin.
Okay, so we shall be talking in the future about perhaps the rest of Africa and the T that is formed by Africa. But how much have you raised so far?
Well, so far we have raised $43 million US, and we are continuing with our fundraising to get to a target of about 150 million. And we should be starting investments soon. We've already identified a pipeline. We have a lot of demand with people coming with very interesting ideas, but of course we ourselves are also going around sourcing for deals that meet this strategy that we're trying to implement.
Frannie Leautier, a partner and CEO of Mkoba Private Equity Fund.